A 747 is a huge metal beast with over 300 tons of metal and glass. So what happens to those 300 tons of airplane when that airplane is no longer useful for flying passengers? What happens to used planes too old, too slow, or that are no longer safe to fly? Getting rid of 300 tons of scrap metal doesn't seem very profitable. More like a huge headache for the airline purchasing these planes when they're new. But in fact, those 300 tons of metal are extremely profitable, and we're going to explore why. Lifespan. Most modern airplanes have a lifespan of 25 to 30 years. The cause for this limited useful life of airplanes is measured in pressurization cycles. Passenger planes must pressurize their cabins in order for the people inside the aircraft to be comfortable at high altitudes. The pressurization puts strain on the frame of the aircraft. Over time, this strain leads to something called metal fatigue. Metal fatigue affects the decompression process, and it can lead to catastrophic failure. Most planes have a useful life of 150,000 flight hours. After that, their integrity can't be guaranteed and they must be retired by law due to the stringent flight regulations of the developed world. Less prosperous nations have less stringent laws regarding how many flight hours an airplane might have, so many of the older models are sold to the third world. Larger planes are refitted as carrier planes, and smaller planes are usually sold to private individuals or groups for very specific missions which don't require the transport of people. Scrapyards. If there is no buyer for an aircraft, then it'll usually head to an aircraft scrapyard, often called an aircraft graveyard or boneyard. This could be a short-term storage situation until a buyer is found or the market improves, or it could be for immediate or slower breakdown and recycling for parts. Eventually, almost all old airplanes are broken down for parts. The decision to dismantle an aircraft most often depends on whether the value of its parts and components is higher than that of the aircraft as a flying machine, says Mark Gregory, managing director of Air Salvage International. The potential of aircraft parts as an asset class is a goldmine for specialized investment firms as well as some hedge funds. Engines are of particular value in the spare parts business, up to 70% of the value of the aircraft itself. The used parts business in 2022 will be worth an estimated $6 billion alone. Most of the scrapyards are located in the southwestern United States, and the used parts market is so profitable that it's not unusual for airlines to take airplanes as young as 10 years of age and sell them for parts to make a profit. The myriad of spare market middlemen has caused another interesting problem for the airlines: counterfeit spare parts. It's estimated that up to 2% of all the spare parts sold around the world might be counterfeit. An old airplane might have upwards of 1,200 functioning parts, and once the engines are removed, there are still many parts which can be salvaged. Once there are no more useful parts to sell, the frame of the ship can be cut into sections and then sold to be used for training purposes for police, firefighters, military, and of course, air stewards. In fact, once the aircraft has been deregistered, it is technically classed as waste, and it has to be processed in compliance with environmental regulations. So many of the companies in the business of buying used airplanes are actually registered as waste management companies. Boneyards might also contain numerous airplanes that have not been decommissioned, but that have been abandoned for various financial or legal reasons. Usually, these airplanes simply rust away with time. However, the vast majority of planes are completely recycled over time, and because boneyards have to comply with a host of environmental regulations, extreme measures are taken to protect most of the decommissioned fleets from decay. Other uses for old planes. Clever entrepreneurs around the globe have seen the potential for scrap planes outside of aviation. Many airplanes manage to reach aviation museums, which saves them from becoming scrap. Others have more interesting resting places. For instance, the former electrical engineer Bruce Campbell turned a Boeing 727 he bought into a home in Portland, Oregon. After modifications, the 65-year-old's aircraft dream home cost him $220,000. Project Freedom in Brookshire, Texas, was thought out and built by airplane enthusiast Joe Axline. It includes two separate planes, an MD-80 and a DC-9-41, both without their wings, resting next to each other and used for living space. The second Boeing 747 ever made and the first to be flown commercially has been turned into a restaurant in Korea. In New Zealand, one of the last Allied 1950 Bristol freighter planes out of Vietnam has been turned into a 2-unit motel. Rustavi, Georgia is home of a Yakolev 42 plane lovingly turned into a kindergarten classroom catering to 5-year-olds who love airplanes. In Florida, you might find it interesting to visit the Cosmic Muffin, which is exactly what it looks like, a plane that traded its wings in order to set sail on water. Dave Drimmer took a Boeing B-307 and turned it into the iconic plane boat after it was deemed unflyable in 1969. An Ilyushin 2-18 has been transformed into a perfect romantic getaway for two. The airplane suite, found in Teague in the Netherlands, was renovated to make room for relaxation essentials, including a jacuzzi, shower, sauna, minibar, and 3 flat-screen TVs. And these are only a few examples of the clever uses for old planes which people all around the world have discovered. Vintage warplanes. If you don't have $250,000 to spend on pieces of an airplane that you'll never fly again, but you love airplanes, you might consider buying a vintage fighter from World War I. To put this in some perspective, an aviation buff today can purchase a typical single-seat World War I aircraft kit, minus the armament, for around $7,500 to $15,000, while a fully assembled machine might cost a little over $40,000. Now, this has made World War I air shows extremely popular around the globe, and enthusiasts looking for bargains on old planes. You might find it far more difficult to purchase more modern aircraft since most of it is actually sold to nations and not individuals for a variety of purposes, from reconnaissance to defense. The great majority of used warplanes end up in boneyards because they don't want to sell them to individuals. But is it legal to buy a fighter jet? The unironic answer is yes, it is. Here are numerous examples of civilian-owned fighters in the U.S. One of the most famous examples came from actor Michael Dorn, who played Worf on Star Trek The Next Generation, who at one point owned his own F-86 Sabre fighter. After 9/11, the U.S. military suspended direct sales of military vehicles, particularly tanks and fighter jets, to civilians, so this jet must have been imported from a NATO or another friendly nation. Would you buy a fighter jet from the late 90s if you had the money? What would you do with it? Certainly, if there is a market, there will be somebody willing to sell the product, even if they're military-grade aircraft.